in particular at some of those places loosely characterized, sometimes inaccurately, as the Red Wall, but broadly the places that haven't necessarily gained from the economic growth or the dynamism of some of our city centres in some parts of England, to try and understand the people who live there, what has happened to them politically, and how things might change in the future. Sophie, if we could stop the screen share now, please. Thank you very much. We've got three great speakers to introduce this topic today. John Tomaney, who's a professor at UCL, a long-standing observer, analyst, commentator on English regional policy and devolution. Baroness Judith Blake, now of course a member of the House of Lords, but long-time leader of Leeds City Council, and could reasonably claim, I think, to be one of the key architects of the West Yorkshire Combined Authority, which has come into existence fairly recently. And finally, an academic colleague of mine at Southampton University, Professor Will Jennings. Will wrote one of the original papers on the two Englands, highlighting the divergence between cosmopolitan and economically successful parts of England and those that had lost out economically and were more socially conservative, and more recently has written about trust in politics and its relationship with levelling up. I'm going to go to John in just a moment to start the webinar. Just for those who are on the call, welcome. Thank you very much. Good to see so many of you joining us. There is obviously the chat function that you'll be familiar with, so you can carry on a parallel discussion, if you like, on issues that have been raised. If you have a question that you'd like me to put to our speakers, please use the Q&A function, question and answer function. That's the one I'll be monitoring. If you go onto that, you can see questions that other people have put. So if you would like to upvote questions that you think are particularly important, that's really helpful to me in the chair. But get us underway. Over to John Tomaney to introduce the politics of place. Thank you, John. You're muted, John.
Thanks, John. I'm just going to try and share my screen here. Can you all see that?
Yep.
Right. Okay, so thanks, John, for the introduction and for the invitation. I'm going to talk about Labour and the politics of place today, partly because I've been working on this very topic for a sort of broader piece of work, which has been put together by Labour Together and will be published later this month. And a group of us have been kicking around this topic, holding seminars, interviewing key actors, if you like, in this debate over the last few months. And these are my collaborators here. So I just want to acknowledge that I'm drawing on work contributed to by others. So we have started off with some, I suppose, axioms that have guided the way we're thinking about the relationship between Labour and the politics of place. We're working on the assumption that place is increasingly central to politics today. But it's certainly, as far as the Labour Party has been concerned, has been neglected in Labour's strategies in all kinds of ways. There's probably a seminar in that, so I'll move on and say that from the point of view of Labour and the issues that John raised in the introduction, I think we conclude that engaging with place is crucial to both renewing Labour's appeal in its traditional heartlands and also to provide lasting solutions to geographical inequalities. And what we recognise is that geographical inequalities in the UK, in England, are very large in international terms among rich countries. And increasingly, I think you can make a case that it's place, not party, which is shaping politics in England. This was a point made by Andy Burnham in one of the seminars that we organised, that in his view, he's representative increasingly of a place which he calls Greater Manchester rather than a party. It's just an interesting way to think about these things. We also know that people in left behind places, as John said, it's a really complex and problematic term, but nevertheless, we all know what we mean when we use that term. are more likely to feel disenfranchised, ignored, and skeptical about politics. And in our seminars, we looked at the very strong evidence on all of this. These are often places which had previously strong communal bonds of one kind or another. And again, there's quite strong evidence that these are fraying in many places. Labour philosophically as well has had a very unhappy relationship with place and the whole question of devolution in England since 1945. The mindset of Labourism after 1945 was very much a top-down centralist approach when it came to governing. Which is in many ways at odds with the history of Labour before 1945. Again, there's another seminar to be organised on all of that. And of course, what all of this means is that recently the Conservatives have owned the place agenda. Post 2010, George Osborne promoted what you might call a big city localism, which accelerated the transformation of the city centres that John mentioned earlier on. And post 2016, of course, there's been this renewed focus on left behind towns. Boris Johnson's first speech specifically mentioned them. This phrase levelling up, and all wrapped up in the broader agenda of taking back control. These things are seen as of a piece, I guess, in Johnsonism, if that's what we want to call it. So levelling up has been the political buzzword of the time. It may not last much longer, given that it's associated very much with somebody whose star is on the wane, let's put it like that. But there is the question of what is levelling up and will it make a difference? There's no question that it responds to real political issues, which I've just sort of outlined very briefly. But what is it? Well, really what it is a potpourri of policies rather than a strategy, including things as diverse as free ports and hanging baskets, leadership and increased R&D outside of the Golden Triangle. Lots of things going on here. And it's by no means clear that these things are going to work. So, for instance, take free ports, which is really a central element of the levelling up agenda. There was a really brutal assessment of the likely impact of free ports in the most recent OBR report on government finances, which basically sort of indicated, it was basically warning us not to have any high hopes around the impacts of free ports in tackling these geographical inequalities. There's a whole issue which has emerged in relation to the levelling up fund around pork barrelling. Very good work showing how this has worked in relation to the Towns Fund. So what's new in all of this? Free ports are arguably just a reheating of enterprise zones. What's new about in relation to R&D strategies? These things are, I think, are very pertinent questions. They may be answered in the white paper, which we're told now will appear later this year, but we don't know what that's going to contain, and it might get lost in the noise. And I suppose the larger question is whether whatever appears and what we've got so far is sufficient to offset the larger forces that are marginalising some communities in England. So, for instance, we can talk about free ports, but if you pick up the local newspaper in Newcastle today, Nexus, the public transport operator which runs the metro service, is talking about its finances collapsing in the coming weeks. So you can have all the R&D you want, but if the trains aren't running, you've got a big problem. There's also a question about where local government reform fits into this agenda. The government floated some ideas around this in the Sunday papers a few weeks before Christmas, and they went down like the proverbial lead balloon. So there's a lot of reasons to be skeptical about this agenda, but and also to be skeptical about the white paper. If you think back to 2020 and the planning white paper, which was going to transform the planning system in England, it's largely died in the time since. So we know there are certain important facts that we need to be aware of. Local government expenditure, massive cuts since 2010, promises of increases, but nowhere near repairing what's happened. I mean, Judith will be able to tell you a lot more about all of this. We have an incredible pattern of churn in regional governance in England. I'm not going to go through all the detail of this particular figure, but what it's there to do, and this is word from the Institute for Government, is to show that we are constantly making and breaking structures of local and regional governance in England in ways which are entirely counterproductive. And we have a pattern of local government, in this case, the West Midlands, which is fragmented, incoherent, and entirely opaque to the citizen. Very important public services delivered in ways in which the citizen finds extraordinarily difficult to grasp, understand, and influence. So we have these long-standing problems, but we must acknowledge that in England we have what we might call structural obstacles to devolution, and these can be summarised, I think, in the following way. First of all, and we could again talk a lot more about this, central governments of all types over a long period have insufficiently trusted subnational government to devolve powers to it. There are many examples around the country of incumbent local politicians opposing local reform for all sorts of reasons. Where proposals have been put forward to improve regional governance, it's been difficult to get agreement around these, particularly about the best spatial scale for local and regional governance. Citizens are unsure about the value of regional governance, and this is probably even more so after austerity the case. And finally, going back to that figure I showed just a moment ago, institutional churn is now part of the problem. The creation and destruction of institutions is now the English way of doing these things, and it's probably not very productive. And in dealing with these problems, the left deals with a set of dilemmas. It struggles with the notion of localism, if you like. It struggles include the balance between equity and devolution. Do we devolve powers in ways which mean the provision of public services is unequal between places? Is that a good thing? Is that socialist or whatever? We struggle in terms of the relationship between participative and representative democracy. We struggle in terms of whether we empower people or place. And that brings the whole Andy Burnham point in about party versus place issue. All of these issues were unresolved under New Labour, often not necessarily very carefully thought through under New Labour, and also under Corbynism. There's an additional problem that some Labour councils have a very poor reputation. So in Deborah Mattinson's book on the Red Wall, she talks about how in left behind places, Red Wall places, many people had more complaints about the local Labour council than they did about Tory austerity. And all of this partially explains Labour's struggle to respond to the levelling up agenda, I think. So what this suggests is that the first step really here is a need for Labour to understand and accept the scale of the economic, political and constitutional challenge it faces if it's going to speak to its former heartlands and also address their underlying social and economic challenges. So in the paper that I talked about, which will appear shortly, we sketch out three issues, three areas where we think which are potentially very promising in thinking about what an agenda might look like for Labour in relation to place. The first is drawing on ideas about the foundational economy. This is a set of ideas which I think are very promising, a new way of thinking about the economy which is very relevant to the place agenda. The foundational economy refers to that part of the economy that creates and distributes goods and services consumed by all, regardless of income and because they support everyday life. Now, traditionally, regional policy in England is focused on improving the performance of the tradable economy, and the foundational economy, which which is crucial for underpinning local living standards, has often been neglected. And this is an area where interventions are possible, which would have impacts in the places that most need them, and in a sense overcome this equity versus devolution dilemma. Huge area to discuss in all of this, and I'm going to pass over it because I think I've only got a couple more points left that I can make in the time available. But Rachel Reeves, interestingly, is on to this agenda. She wrote a pamphlet a little while back about the everyday economy, which is an attempt to engage with this kind of thinking. So, you know, for many left behind places, improving research and development might be good for the broader economy, but does it impact on their local lives in the way that, for instance, improving the provision of buses does? A second concept that is being widely discussed at the moment, or more widely discussed, which I think is relevant to this agenda, concerns the notion of social infrastructure, the physical places and organizations that shape the way people interact. Very influential book out of the States on this by Klinenberg, who's at NYU, who's looked at these spaces within which differences are managed, local attachments are formed, and cohesive communities are forged. And I think there's quite a lot of very persuasive evidence that the decline in social infrastructure in so-called left behind places underpins the sorts of feelings of loss and lack of control which the Tories have successfully observed, but haven't quite found a way to tap into politically yet, I think, beyond the take back control rhetoric. And we are doing some work at UCL in a village in County Durham, which I think really supports this idea of the importance of social infrastructure. So, and another nice piece of work came recently out of LSE looking at the role of pub closures in fomenting political disenchantment in England. So finally then, just to conclude in my last minute, crucial to all of this is devolution and the broader devolution of power, and within it, the role of strong and effective local governments. So we sketch out some of the issues around all of this. And in particular, think about, thinking if you had an incoming Labour government committed to an agenda to improve place, what would this look like? Well, there'd be a strong case for the rapid reinforcement of existing devolved bodies. There are devolved structures in England now which are gaining legitimacy, even if they remain rather weak. Combined authorities, particularly mayoral combined authorities, being one important example of that. But we know that we need to have institutions at the larger than the local scale in order to manage all kinds of infrastructure and public service provision issues. Increasingly, we think that these should be built out of what exists already rather than created anew. That involves working within the existing patchwork of governance to enhance capacity and resources where the appetite for this exists, because it doesn't always exist. And it's hard work to achieve this objective if there isn't that appetite. There are lessons to be learned from Labour successes, particularly the successes of some of the metro mayors in this respect. Again, we could unpack all of that, but what was interesting about last year's local elections was how very quickly a narrative of Labour defeat became the story of those elections, when in reality there were some interesting successes in all of that deserve attention. Primarily, of course, what strong and effective local government requires are stable constitutional and fiscal frameworks. Again, that's a bullet point that opens up a huge area of discussion. But one element of that must be diversifying the tax base of local government, and there's ways in which this can be done. And then finally, given what I said earlier about the problematic performance of particularly of Labour local government in some places, there's a very powerful argument to be made for devolving power beyond local government to community organisations. So New Local, for instance, has talked about enabling councils as the way forward. And our work in villages in County Durham certainly, I would argue, points to this. some of the great dynamism in the most left behind places is not found in local government, but is found in the community organisations which operate, in some cases, it has to be said, despite local government, not because of it. And within all of this, we need space for emerging regional identities within England. And that would include a kind of accommodation or a space for the expression of what you might call the northern grievance, which Burnham and the other metro mayors in the north have been very successful, I think, at articulating. So that's my 15 minutes of fame, and I'll stop there and I'll hand back over to John.
John, thank you very much indeed. And that's a hugely interesting and challenging agenda that you've set out there, but it can follow the shape of it very, very clearly. Can I just remind people who are on the webinar, please do put questions into the Q&A that I can have for the panelists later on. But I'm going to move on now to Judith Blake, who was, I think it's fair to say, at the sharp end, both of some of those financial changes you were talking about, but also the challenges of dealing with central government on devolution. So Judith, it'd be very interesting to have your response to what John had to say.
Thank you, John, and can I say an enormous thank you to John for laying out the case and the arguments so clearly, and I find it really thought-provoking. And my personal situation is I stepped down as leader of Leeds City Council in just at the end of February last year, so less than a year ago, knowing that I was going to step down from the council in May and taking up my seat in the House of Lords. I'm now on the front bench in the House of Lords, and I've just moved across from the Department of Levelling Up to have a more central role in BEIS, or BIS as we call it now, as energy has moved out under Ed Miliband. So a really interesting position in terms of how we actually come up with some solutions to the issues that John raised so eloquently. And I think it's worth just repeating, so it's at the forefront of our mind just how far behind we are in England, especially in terms of devolution. And I talk to colleagues a lot down here in terms of the model of devolution in Scotland and Wales. And certainly from a local government perspective, and Labour in Wales in particular, and what's happened in Scotland, I think there's a real sense that there's been devolution in Scotland in particular to the Assembly, but it hasn't gone down much further. So local government in Scotland is really struggling from that whole agenda, and yet there is a perception that devolution is working through there, which I think we need to look and learn and actually be very mindful of what's happened. So what we know is internationally that the UK is really near the top on a wide range of indicators of regional inequality. It's probably one of the most unequal large industrial countries. And how can we link that to the lack of progress in devolution and the fact that England is probably the most centralised country certainly in the industrial West, if you like. And the interesting thing for me is the work that's been done on tracking local engagement in areas of high centralisation and the very poor electoral turnouts, for example, in those areas. And I think that's something we need to be mindful of, because running through all of this, first of all, absolutely agree that we need to have a really robust narrative for what we mean by devolution, what it's going to deliver, why people in our communities should engage with it and support it, and actually take part in elections that hopefully will come from it on a wider level. But the frustration really that even though we have made progress and we have established directly elected mayors of quite a significant amount of the north now, though still some way to go, talking to those the metro mayors, their real frustration in the lack of power that they have. And actually the COVID experience over the last 2 years almost now, it was really local government that led the response to government, because we have the vested powers around public health, for example, and real ability to get directly out into the business community to administer the loans that came through, et cetera, et cetera. And I think there's just a growing frustration at the level of metro mayors that they have enormous soft power, if you like, and the fact that the media go to them and they are the centre of discussion, but the lack of direct fiscal powers, for example, remains an enormous challenge. My concern with the way that things are moving forward, that all of the different funding regimes, that it really is quite obscene how different local areas have to bid for money. It's competitive, it's not collaborative. It's almost a case of my deprivation is worse than yours and is more deserving. But in the way that it's used politically as a tool of division is something we need to be very wary of. And as John said, the austerity agenda has been devastating for large parts of the country. And this isn't just a north-south discussion. And also within the north, there are areas of high affluence as well as those areas that are really struggling. And we have to be aware of that ability to be manipulated, if you like, to make sure that the progress that we need to make doesn't actually happen. And I would say from my own personal experience, it isn't just the politicians that we need to be aware of and their agenda, it's also Whitehall itself, which I'm afraid, and this is from looking at it very close up and even more so now, has so much aversion to real devolution that it's hard to see how we can make progress when we have such a narrow and short political timetable in terms of political advantage of getting into power and then what you can do with it, and then looking forward and anticipating the next election. So we know that the devolution white paper got put to one side. We know Michael Gove has moved in to take over the DLUC department, as it's known affectionately down here. And again, the levelling up, a much anticipated white paper, is being delayed. It was supposed to be out before Christmas. It's now that I hear it's the week beginning the 24th of January, but we have to wait and see what that comes. But just to give a bit of context and a bit of experience from what it was like being the leader of Leeds City Council, working within Yorkshire and the North. And I have to say that, being involved in one of the large cities in the North, the George Osborne Northern Powerhouse project did give us a boost, and it encouraged us as the 5 main cities to work together. We went to China, we went on investment trips together, for example, and there was a real sense that we could make a difference working together at that level. We established Transport for the North as the first statutory transport body outside of London, and really we did feel that we were getting some traction, and I guess Manchester was the first to break away and go for the Metro Mayor model, which wasn't universally welcome across other areas. I have to say, we'd all had referendums and a very strong local view that wasn't the way that we wanted to go. So there was resistance in other parts in terms of the model, a real irritation and annoyance that government and Whitehall seemed, although they kept saying the rhetoric was, of course, it's got to be locally determined and locally determined with local government and representing their local population. But in our case, we wanted to move forward with devolution for Leeds City Region, which incorporates districts from outside of West Yorkshire, 3 mainly in North Yorkshire, including York, so Harrogate, Selby and Craven. And we couldn't convince government that even though this was our functioning economic area, and it just made sense for us to go together and to overcome those bureaucratic obstacles that the government had artificially, in our view, put in, And we were told that we couldn't have Leeds City Region, but we had to go away and come up with our own bespoke model. So we went away and we came up with the One Yorkshire model. And against all expectation and government trying to tell us that leaders in Yorkshire couldn't get on with each other, we got pretty well universal sign up. We set up a Yorkshire Leaders Board with the councils from across Yorkshire, and we set up the One Yorkshire Committee, bringing together all of the partners. And both those are still in existence, but it became clear that the funding tap was being turned off because we weren't progressing with the West Yorkshire mayoral models. So we decided we had to be pragmatic. We couldn't get left behind in that way. And we decided across Yorkshire to follow that South Yorkshire would go ahead and draw down the powers, which it hadn't done, and West Yorkshire would establish a mayoral model, which it did. And I'm delighted to say actually that we were successful in electing the first female Metro Mayor, which is a whole other story that I think we need to be mindful of in terms of representation and attraction and reach to the people we're hoping to take part in. North Yorkshire is going through the process of actually reorganising now so that they can move forward, and their districts will be dissolved and become unitary. And there, I understand there will be a directly elected mayor. So what we have is a situation where we could have had Yorkshire devolution with all of that issue of pride, trust, recognition of brand, incredible diversity in terms of peoples, but geography, economic, energy production, transport, all of those things. And we've had to go down to 4 separate models with all of the expense that entails. So I hope we've certainly in Yorkshire, there is still the hope that One Yorkshire, the sense around One Yorkshire will come through eventually. But what we know is that we can't just be bought off with promises of infrastructure investment. This has to be, we have to really go down to the grassroots. And I think this is the point that John was making. We have to address the issues that are concerning people in our communities. So skills, poverty, health inequalities, which have just been absolutely at the forefront through the whole COVID experience. We have to be able to move away to a sustainable funding footprint, a longer term agenda, building on the work that the UK 70 Commission under Bob Kerslake has put forward. But most of all, we have to all work together to come up with a fair and transparent funding mechanism. The funding mechanisms and the money that is very slow at coming forward is done in such an opaque way, and there really is huge cynicism about the motivation and the methodology that's being used. And one of the disappointments about the levelling up white paper, and something we need to look out for, is the rumours that there is no money attached to it. So how on earth it's going to resolve the real structural issues that are facing us. So some steps forward, I have to say, on this agenda, and a lot of experience to draw on. And actually, I really do believe local government has to be at the centre of this. It's essential that there is that democratic mandate at a local level. And a lot actually of the polling is suggesting that people do trust local politicians now more than national politicians. And I think that's something we need to look at. But engagement will be linked to increased powers coming down to a local level. And we have a way to go on that. But there is an enormous determination around this agenda, a real recognition that lack of progress is what's holding us back, and a real sense that if we could move forward in so many of the areas that John outlined, then we could really seriously start talking about transforming the life chances of people in our communities right across the country. Thank you.
Judith, thank you very much indeed. And that experience is fascinating to hear the way that you ended up with what you finally got in West Yorkshire and what might have been. Just to say to people who want to take part in the chat, quite a few notes are coming through just to hosts and panelists. You can click to send your chat comments to everyone. So if you want to make sure you do that to open up the discussion, that would be great. And please do keep the questions coming in. We're already getting quite a few. So Judith was talking at the end there about trust and local politicians, which I think brings us neatly to Will Jennings and perhaps your more recent research. Will.
Thanks, John. And I may say a word or two about trust as we go on. And thanks to Judith and John for your paper and your presentation, which I'll respond to. I think on one level, you'll get very little argument from me that place matters to politics and Labour politics specifically. Jerry Stoker, who I see as in the attendees, and I have been making this point for about 7-8 years. And I think actually, it was an observation that we had and opened up discussions about really back in 2014, even before the Brexit vote. This was something that was increasingly important and obvious, and it was actually fracturing the coalitions of both electoral parties. I think often this is framed as a Labour problem, but I think it's a much more general tendencies that's shaping British politics. And as you said, we're increasingly understanding British politics through the lens of place. It's certainly true that we talk about two Englands. Jeremy Cliff wrote about Clacton to Cambridge. We talk about the red wall, the blue wall, and Patrick English was writing this recently about the yellow belt. I think there's an increasing tendency to talk about place, and I will then go against about 8 years of argument from me and say it is important for us to remember why at an individual level, but also at a macro level, place is an expression of a wider range of trends nationally. So Jerry and I in our work started this focus on electoral geographical polarization, which, as we all now know, is Labour doing better in cities, Conservatives in towns. But I think it's so important to remember that reflects the changing demographics of places, with towns getting older, cities getting younger, more diverse, more graduates, towns stagnating, I think would be a fair choice of words to describe it. Actually, I think when we started out, we started talking about shrinking places, but various reviewers and editors said, well, actually, places aren't shrinking; they're just not growing and to the same extent as certain urban areas. But those changing demographics of places also reflect the fundamental economic model of the past 40 years. And actually, John, I think one thing that was interesting in your paper was, I didn't really see the words agglomeration too much. And on one level, I think that agglomeration model that we have shifted towards, focused on the knowledge economy and services in the wake of the decline of traditional industries, is absolutely central to what we're seeing in those demographic shifts and our changing economic model. And it's why those former industrial towns and coastal towns have seen the sharpest decline, why they're aging, why also there are huge pressures, I think, and will be increasingly so on things like social care, why it's difficult to sustain public infrastructure and transport infrastructure in places that aren't as densely populated with as active economic populations, why those places have seen lower inward investment. And I think for me that emphasis on agglomeration is really important, because it actually emphasizes this is not an easy tractable problem to solve for government. I think levelling up has presented something it's an area where we can have simple solutions about places. And so in political terms, I think the educational polarization we see, which is national, is expressed through geography, because we have an uneven distribution of graduates in the country. We have age polarization is expressed through geography, because we have a demographic distribution that is unequal. And so I think, and I'm trying to push against this for the past few years. I think you're obviously not guilty of this, but places like the Red Wall are treated as sort of mystical places with special authentic qualities. And although there might be some contextual effects, there's something different about living in a town from a major urban centre. A lot of the trends and the factors we're seeing are about the composition of places, and about how those places have been drifting apart in demographic terms. I think one of the really interesting things that I think was a little bit behind in your paper, but I think is that the factor about party electoral success is also increasingly structured by geography, but actually party organisation is as well. I may say in a minute that one of the observations Jerry and I made in I think it was an article for Renewal a few years ago, was suggesting that for Labour, one of the solutions might be a sort of an exchange program for its activists. It's actually, and I think we certainly saw that in the 2017 election, if a party is increasingly concentrated and its supporters are increasingly concentrated in large urban centres, its activist base becomes actually increasingly unrepresentative of the wider country. And I think Labour's challenge actually is about getting its its party members in Islington and Hackney to interact with its party members in Wakefield and Barrow and Furness. Actually, I think that's a really major challenge for Labour Party about cultural exchange within the Labour movement. One of the things I think is really interesting in this space is about, we tend to connect these debates about regional productivity with devolution, but I think that's still contestable about whether levelling up really needs to have a devolution component. I'm obviously someone who's sympathetic to arguments for decentralisation, but I think it is interesting to consider a world in which some of the policy solutions remain centralised. Not that I really believe that's the case, but I think sometimes it's easy to rush to devolution as a solution without getting back to the fundamentals. Just shifting on a little bit, I mean, I think one of the interesting things around levelling up is this shift of conservative focus from agglomeration and city regions to towns, which I think has to be seen partly as about political expediency as the unifying feature. I think the shift from George Osborne to Theresa May and then Boris Johnson has reflected in a fundamental rethinking of kind of conservative strategy, but that reflects a degree of political incoherence that in some ways is about political adaptation. It's actually, I think you and Andy Pike in an essay in Political Quarterly identified the political incoherence of levelling up. But I actually would say on one level that doesn't matter as much. Obviously from policy terms it matters fundamentally to us, but I think in political terms it may not be as damaging as people think. And so that I saw in the Q&A there was a question about, is levelling up spectacle? And Jerry and I certainly have argued that one of the features of levelling up is its spectacle character, that kind of potpourri of policy measures you talked about, actually of free ports and so forth is a feature, not a bug. And so, the very interesting and important work that Chris Hanretty's done on pork barrel politics, for example, for those of us in sort of policy circles think this is an outrageous way to allocate public funds, but voters think, well, that's quite good. I'm getting some pork for my local area. And I think that's for the Labour Party really deep challenge of responding to levelling up as a political strategy, because while at a structural level we may think this is not a solution to addressing problems of geographical inequality, local voters think, well, that's a very nice £25 million investment in my local area. The government cares about my local area and they're recognising there's a problem. And I think that's a really important political aspect of the debate. So I think there is a dilemma for the left of how to respond to spectacle and pork barrel politics, and this divergence in its parliamentary party and its activists. And I think in devolution, the one thing we know, as with previous Labour governments, is that all governments are resistant to giving power away. And so in opposition, it is very easy to develop an agenda based around devolution, decentralisation and so forth. It is less easy when entering office to actually follow through on that. Just to kind of focus on the final couple of aspects, I think that there's a challenge of how we relate these relatively opaque policy debates, such as about the foundational economy, to feelings of distrust, resentment, and loss of faith in Labour representation, but just more broadly in those constituencies. And I think for the left and for Labour, there is a challenge of what sort of narrative can give people back a feeling of empowerment. I think certainly decentralisation, devolution is a potential avenue for this, but I think it's not. It can be very easily, as New Labour found in the 2000s, devolution can be framed as another layer of politics, which people are not so keen on. But when given a vote on a kind of regional parliament, John Prescott's pet project, voters weren't necessarily sympathetic, and so I think there is a challenge of presenting a new sort of decentralised, evolved form of politics in a way that doesn't just reinforce feelings of distrust of more politics that people don't like. I think the point you made around social infrastructure is important, and places are important, but I actually think there should be more emphasis in the levelling up debate around socioeconomic foundations even before we get there. I think one of the reasons why that emphasis on place is valuable, but I think not enough, is that actually a policy offer for places needs to not neglect things like early years, education, skills, health, public services. I think there's a real danger with the levelling up agenda and the focus on place that we silo off a lot of really fundamental policy issues and policy weaknesses for particular places when they're still absolutely fundamental to the offer of why towns struggle is part down to skills, but we can't address skills gaps and so forth without thinking about the whole lifetime experience of people who are born in a particular place. And I think just a kind of final couple of points. I think the questions of local government and devolution are one solution, but I think we have to consider them in the context of a shrinking tax and spending base. And as Labour has seen in various parts of the country, there is a danger for local party government being punished by voters for austerity imposed by the centre. And so I think it is all very well for us to talk about local government settlements, creating devolved institutions, mayors and so forth. But if we are in a context, and the word that has not been used, on one level, it's nice to have a workshop where we don't mention the B word of Brexit, but Brexit is fundamentally an unspoken challenge, because if we are facing another decade or two of stagnant at best growth, how does this empowerment of local governance impact on support for progressive politics if voters are increasingly disillusioned with what they're getting, if it is local, if power is being transferred to local governance simply to enforce cuts and austerities? That I think is a huge problem. I think that the final thing I'll just say in this space, and partly because John is organising the seminar, is the importance of identity. And I think the real challenge there are two challenges around a devolution, a devolved governance settlement around levelling up. I think the first is just the obviously patchwork, incoherent nature of existing governance, and about how one reforms a system that is so messy and scratchy and so negotiated with combined authorities in some areas, mayors and others, and so forth. I mean, how do we, is this about just a series of bespoke negotiated settlements in different places? Are we just going to increase the mess of our governance patchwork? And then the other, I think, is one of the areas in which I first became really interested in devolved governance, is about the role of identity in those governance solutions. So obviously, in some ways, Greater Manchester works as a kind of political and a governance solution because of a sense of regional identity, although having worked with people from Wigan and Bolton, there is still a sense that those micro regional identities are not always actually comfortable with power going to what they would see the centre of Greater Manchester. And and here in the south, obviously, there is a question, as we saw with some of the debates around devolution in Hampshire and the Isle of Wight. It's about how one comes up with devolved settlements. Say, for example, a mayor bridging Portsmouth and Southampton, where people have quite distinct and divided local identities, and I think, or just weaker local identities. And so I think that, for me, is that real challenge for this whole agenda, as to if there is to be a sort of devolved governance agenda about what sort of fundamental institutional architecture it has, but also what identity architecture. If we believe that identity is actually key to part of the success, for example, of the Greater Manchester settlement as it is, can we find that everywhere? And are we going to end up with more of a patchwork quilt approach to English governance?
Well, thank you very much indeed. And I suppose on that last point, where identity does exist, how do we get government as the centre to accept it? I mean, I'm sitting here in Winchester, where a combined authority bid from Southampton and Portsmouth, which was supported, was rejected by central government, not because local government or local people were against it, but because of some, this is public knowledge, not private knowledge, some MPs were against it. Judith faced the situation where one Yorkshire was supported in Yorkshire, but not in Whitehall. So I'm going to come to the role of central government in just a moment, but I'm going to try and do disservice to people's questions, but by grouping some of the themes. So what I really want to do is pick up points raised by Ian Lucas and also Sarah Bogle. Ian raises a particular point about the failure of EU regional policy politically to which you could probably add the failure of Labour's own domestic RDA strategy as a political strategy. They were abolished very quickly after 2010 with very few tears shed in most parts of the country. And Sarah Bogle asked a question about whether there are other countries we can look to who've got this right and how you go about doing it. Now, those are all subjects for a seminar in their own right. But John, I wonder if you could say a bit about why you couldn't really fault New Labour's ambitions to deliver regionally, I would suspect, and the money looks eye-watering compared with what's being spent these days, but it wasn't hugely popular with the voters. What went wrong? And perhaps I can ask Judith if she's got views on international experience or places that she's seen that we can draw on. You're muted, John.
Yeah, I mean, actually, on the other countries question, I mean, I don't think any country gets it right, but I think few places get it as wrong as the UK does. I think that's my answer to that question. In terms of the failure of EU regional policy stroke New Labour RDA policy, and the reasons for the failure of that is that, I mean, I think, none of these policies were really locally owned. I mean, there was a great effort to persuade people that that EU regional policy was something that was constructed within that EU regional plans were constructed within the region, and that RDAs were somehow creating regional economic strategies. But we know that neither of those things is really true. I spent quite a lot of my early academic career evaluating EU regional policy, and while it had much to commend it, there were lots of strengths to it in theory. In practice, I think in many places around the world, it was not really understood as something that emerged from partnerships between regions and local actors. It was seen as something which EU priorities that were being implemented locally through these regional planning mechanisms. In places like, say, the Northeast, for instance, as just to take an example, during the Thatcher era, of course, it provided, in theory at least, additional resources that wouldn't have been present otherwise in a context where regional policy was scaled back after the 1970s, high point, if you like, of expenditure. But again, this is something which was largely, it was a political missed opportunity by the EU, really, to, it was largely, and it was not understood by local people how this reflected their needs and aspirations, I think. And I think the same is also true with regional development agencies. I think, you're quite right that their weakness was revealed by how quickly they were dispensed with, even in the places where there was more support for them than others. And I think is an important lesson to be drawn from that. I think advancing the creation of institutions at the local and regional scale, which have a chance of lasting, being strategic, even in the difficult context that Will was outlining about limited resources, would require them to have wide local ownership. And I think that's something which wasn't really the case under New Labour. They weren't seen as having wide local ownership, and that's not to say that that they didn't do useful things at certain points, but they did it often in ways which didn't commend themselves to local actors, not just citizens, 90% of whom probably never even knew they had a regional development agency, but more importantly, to people who would have been their advocates at the point where they came under threat. So I think the big lesson for me in all of this is that if you're going to restructure local and regional institutions, a lot more effort has to go into constructing these around a wide local agreement as to what this restructuring is for and what the benefits are that would accrue.
Thank you. Judith.
Sorry, yes. It's really interesting reflecting back and just thinking about how easy it became to undermine the what was happening in Europe and the benefit that regional funding brought into the country, because actually here we never celebrated it, we never acknowledged it. I remember going to Ireland and being really struck by all of the development projects, and they had big signs on the side of most of them saying funded by the EU, and you never saw that in Great Britain at all. And it was almost an embarrassment of acknowledging that there was a positive benefit to being in Europe. And obviously there's huge debate about how the structural funds are reallocated around the country, in a real sense that if, being absorbed back into Whitehall and they come out again on the unfair funding models that we've seen, that areas that really did benefit significantly from regional funding are going to really feel that they've been left behind. Leeds actually wasn't a huge gainer from structural funds. We're a very large city, and known as the 50-50 city in terms of affluence. But just thinking about the way the Northeast used European funding to invest in culture and the transformation that brought, with the Angel of the North, but also real investment in culture in the Northeast, was something that perhaps we need to revisit and look back. But the RDAs, so in terms of good examples, I'd say, some countries like Ireland and other European countries much better at actually promoting the positives. Although the involvement I had through Eurocities, there was a real sense that actually it needed reform, and that's what we never grasped, that the potential for reform in Europe, and the dissatisfaction in many European countries with the model that exists. But just in terms of regional policy, I remember going to Germany to talk about education and being in Berlin and asking the local education leaders there how they, what the interface between the federal government and the regional government was, and they looked at me and in disbelief, and they said, we don't have the equivalent of the Department for Education in Germany. It's all administered through local regional models, responding to need, responding to the local skills needs, and the education system fitting around that. But in terms of RDAs, I think, if I can be so bold to say this, there was a problem with New Labour and trust in local government. And a number of bodies, health was another area. It was actively discouraged that local authorities would be directly involved. So we mustn't forget that regional assemblies were set up alongside RDAs, and that was where that was supposed to be dealt with. But it meant that issues that were so important to local people at a regional level, like housing and transport, for example, weren't on the agenda of the RDAs. So there, for so many areas of real where local communities would look to the RDAs for leadership, that it just wasn't there. It wasn't part of their policy makeup. So I think that's one of the reasons why it was so easy for them to be dismantled, because there was a disconnect. But some of the work they did has been enduring. And you look at the manufacturing park in South Yorkshire, for example, which was run through Yorkshire Forward, linking with the universities in South Yorkshire. And that as a model is something that we need to look at in a really positive way, of how we can re-establish those local connections, working with our business communities, getting the investment in, because quite frankly, I think it's going to be a very long journey to getting the sort of investment that we need from government back into the agenda. So I think we need to look at them and learn. But there are so many questions at the moment. We don't know what the governments are intending to do with LEPs, for example. I mean, if anyone knows, then please do tell me. But where are we going to be able to recreate those local strong relationships that actually help direct investment and delivery on the ground?
Thank you, Judith. And I think that reinforces John's point about the way in which traditional views of economic development leave out key issues in the foundational economy and other most basic services. Will, I'm going to come to you for a different question, if I may, which is to ask you to put your crystal ball on, because there's always the danger of fighting last year's battles. A number of questions have come in about changing patterns. So Brian Moss raised one about the retail footfall, not going to the high street. Chris Clark, I think, raised one about the impact of COVID on ways of working. Paul Luzzi asked one about social media and how that's affecting communications, and Hal Lloyd talked about the flows of people moving by age and income to different parts of the country. So I suppose one of the questions I wanted to ask you to think about is, what's the position going to be like in 5 or 10 years' time? Will it be the same battles we're fighting? Or are these different social trends going to intensify the problems we've been talking about? Are they potentially able to relieve some of them?
So that's a bit of a difficult futurology. I mean, I think where to start, really. I think there is a tendency with the pandemic to assume that everything will change and there'll be a dramatic shift, as opposed to some sort of reversion to pre-existing patterns. So, the kind of outflow of people from London, for example, the people who are able to work remotely, commute to smaller towns and so forth. And I think there is certainly a possibility that the long-term legacy of the pandemic might be to see outflows of populations to more suburban, rural areas with, and see a slight shift of those. But I don't think we should expect a huge demographic turnaround in the dynamics we're facing. And I think that in some regards, if you'd asked me about the stereotypical former industrial left behind town, I don't think the demographic profile of those places and the challenges those places will change hugely. I actually do think, in terms of the forces of agglomeration, that some places like market towns, for example, which haven't to date struggled, I think the decline of the high street is a little bit of a marker about how places are changing. But I actually think things like automation, traditionally there was a space for professional classes in market towns. As we see things like, for example, law, accounting, shifting to potentially shifting to more automated services, we might actually see local economies in market towns which haven't struggled as much potentially being challenge. And I think so that my little marker for changing economic geography is that certain sorts of towns that haven't struggled in the way that former industrial towns might in the next 15 years start to see some challenges. I mean, I think if I may just jump back to the previous question a little bit as well, is I think one of the things to reflect in terms of the past 20 years actually, and I think one of the problems that Labour has, I think, is it's easy to tell an overly negative story about the regional policy under New Labour, because in some senses, a lot of the trends we're seeing about the successes of cities in Greater Manchester are because cities were seen as a problem, and city region policies were addressing some of the concerns around cities. And so in some senses, perhaps some of the lessons that we should have of the kind of New Labour's approach to regional governance and to economic geography is that perhaps some of the same sorts of solutions that worked, for example, for Greater Manchester, that mean that Greater Manchester is now seen as a success story compared to some outlying towns, we should start to think about those in micro terms for smaller, more peripheral places. And so I think that's one of the challenges in the context of this workshop. One of the challenges, I think, for the left is not to get caught up in an overly negative story about we've never done anything for these places, everything has been a failure. And one of the truths is someone who's far more an expert on, like John is an expert on this far more than I am, is that resolving these fundamental economic geographical challenges, which are hundreds of years old, is not easy. And so actually in that regard, I think it's so important that any policy debate doesn't sort of suggest that we can suddenly kind of completely rebalance the economy. It's about, some of the policy solutions have to be about mitigating, about making places better places to live. You're on mute, John, sorry.
I'm sure everybody else would like to come in on that point, but I'll perhaps pick those up later. I want to bring in at least one more topic, if I can, into the discussion, which comes up in a number of questions, which is really about central government. And the message you get in the webinar so far is that there's actually a cross-party consensus in Westminster, which is that councils are a bit rubbish. councillors aren't very good or very representative, and if you want something done, you really need to do it and control it from the centre. And this seems to be with us for a long time. What John laid out, and I think Judith did too, and Will in a sense, is the need for a different type of consensus, one that is far more respectful of the role of local communities and of local government, far more willing to risk fiscal devolution, but also redistribution of wealth and so on. So my question really to you in different ways is how do we bring about politically, and this seminar's been about Labour, but I think it applies to all political parties, an approach to these issues which is different in the structures of local government, the relationships between centre and local? Or are we stuck in a position where it's all going to be what somebody called in the chat, spectacle, performative, mayors with no powers, but with platforms, hanging basket announcements to make it look as though you're going to do something? And it seems to me we can't really change something locally unless we change stuff at the centre. So what's the strategy for doing that? And what role can English local leaders, local government play in bringing that about? Who would like to go first? Judith, you have come from local to the Labour Party front bench, so yes, it's possibly it's all down to you. But I mean,
well, do you know what? I think the whole COVID experience was a real window for many communities in terms of what local authorities do, and how the response was extraordinary, phenomenal, and this is across the piece. And you know, we were as leaders faced with dysfunction, quite honestly, from central government and a sense of being caught in the headlights. And it was local government that really stepped up to the plate and brought all of the different players together and really delivered for people in their communities. But I think what we're not so good at is, you know, so for a while, the narrative when anyone spoke was, we must thank obviously the health service, our carers, etc., and local government for the incredible work they did holding the fabric of our lives together. But very often we too quickly move on from that. And perhaps as part of the narrative we need to really establish is to keep revisiting the successes. One former Labour leader who has been in the House of Commons, isn't anymore, said to me that one of the problems is when you become an MP, suddenly your mailbag is full of letters complaining about things that haven't been done. Nobody writes them, say, oh, it's wonderful, my bin has been collected every week successfully as was promised. You know, that's taken for granted. And I think, you know, perhaps all of us need to really do far more to celebrate what local government does very well. And whilst we've seen a real reduction in direct powers for local governments, I think the powers of influence at a local level have grown, and other players, so the business community, education providers, all of the different players around place and delivering for people in an area, actually have a huge respect for what local government does. But we don't tell the story enough, and really I think that's what we have to do. And through that, make sure that everything we're talking about, so delivering at a regional, sub-regional, regional level, is about responding to people's real needs. So the climate emergency is a case in point. So yes, we need to obviously be aware of the threat to the planet and the need to reduce carbon, but we also need to frame that in positives for local people who are facing, financial hardship in a way that we've not seen for decades, in terms of fuel bills, which for many people were terrible anyway. So how can we make sure that all of that is done and involves people in the decisions that are made? So Leeds Climate Commission, for example, that we set up, now replicated into Yorkshire Climate Commission, the template, if you like, for the national work that's been done, setting up citizens' juries, getting out, reaching people who aren't convinced about the agenda, but actually going out and converting them and realizing that things can be done successfully. at a local level. It's a very empowering agenda. So there are examples we can use, but I just don't think, I think it's too easy to dismiss, oh, the whole of local government's rubbish. You know, we know it isn't. And there are very fine examples of absolutely brilliant work happening right across the country. And that's, I think we need to focus on how we can build on that, celebrate that, and therefore then make the case for more powers to enable them to do even more.
Thank you. John.
Yeah, I think, you know, I think one of the big issues in all of this for me, you know, is something which I touched on at the end and which Will picked up on and Judith has picked up on as well. And this concerns questions of local identity and regional identity. I think these are crucial in this whole debate, and we're not, you know, we must give them the attention that they deserve, really. And I think central government really doesn't grasp this, you know. So Patrick Diamond, who's one of the group who have been working with on this stuff for Labour Together, has argued that central government is like a manic man, you know, pulling levers, trying to make things happen and discovering that nothing's going on. And as Judith says, in many places, local government has stepped in very constructive and innovative ways in the pandemic and reveals potential. It doesn't exist everywhere, but it certainly exists in places, and there's opportunities to expand that out. But within communities, I think these questions of local identity are really crucial to making these connections. You know, I mean, of course, Will's quite right to say that, you know, the composition of places is to some extent, you know, in many respects, an artifact of you know, wider social categories, if you like. But there is something more going on in these places. You know, certainly in the villages that we're looking at, there's very strong sense, despite everything, of community identity, which is insufficiently recognised, even at times by the local authority, but certainly by the state in general. You know, there is no engagement with this whole agenda, I think, and I think it's really important. I mean, my view is that, you know, the need for belonging and attachments is a human need, and we have created an economic model which has destroyed the basis for forming attachments and feeling a sense of belonging to our communities. So the economic model that Will was talking about, which has transformed city centres, is really, you know, and you know, lots of glass and steel and cranes on the skyline and this kind of thing, has not produced or has not dealt with the feeling of loss, which is in many communities which have seen their traditional ways of earning a living disappear, nothing replacing them, and all the social infrastructures that developed around that vanishing. So to me, this really requires a kind of localist response, and I think that the UK state, central government, Whitehall, is utterly ill-equipped for this task. They don't even realise that it is a task that needs to be performed, and it reaches its absolute nadir, you know, in Dominic Cummings' idea that he was going to have a big room in 10 Downing Street with all these screens providing with real-time data about what was happening. You know, it isn't going to work. But if you go to even the most disadvantaged places, you find incredible people doing amazing things to improve their communities. And then the question is, how do we unleash, enable, and encourage that kind of activity? And that seems to me you know, I mean, I don't know whether this is something the Labour Party is particularly interested in, but I think without it, we will see the you know, the kind of stasis and decline that Will was describing as being characteristic of these places, you know, and actual depopulation, you know, in some places, in particularly former mining villages, where people just, you know, kids just leave because there's absolutely no reason to stay. There's a great book by Fiona Hill, Trump's former advisor, on Russia, who's actually from County Durham, and the title of her book is "There's Nothing for You Here." She's the daughter of a Durham miner, and she, you know, her father said, "Oh, get out," you know, and she ended up in DC as a sort of foreign policy expert as a result. But it's a really good book on explaining the qualitative nature of all of this, rather than just focusing on the quantitative characteristics of these places.
Will.
Thanks, John. And I think that kind of qualitative story is actually really important. I mean, I think just a couple of things. Actually, the Patrick Diamond's line about the kind of pulling on the levers is something I'm sure that Rod Rhodes was writing about the core executive on the kind of the PM and the core executive go to pull the levers in Whitehall and they don't do anything. I think it's a long story about British government. I think I'll maybe have to say a negative point and then a positive point. Really, I think in one regard, I think the negative story about levelling up and place that we might tell ourselves over the coming years is that, as we see the current incumbent of number 10 struggling with his various political problems and the potential successors not really being seen as committed to levelling up, certainly in fiscal terms, I think I personally don't expect to see too much of substance in terms of policy, and certainly in terms of redistribution, in terms of spending, that we might actually see a serious effort in terms of addressing regional inequality, just simply because of the fiscal situation and the Chancellor's seeming tight hold on the purse strings, and certainly as a potential successor to the Prime Minister. I think I can't see the post-Boris Johnson Conservative Party offering a form of levelling up that is particularly structural in nature. I think it will still be focused on relatively superficial spectacle around the high streets, town centres, micro projects around little things around manufacturing and so forth, but nothing that structurally addresses these problems about essentially nothing being there for people in places. And that, I think, that really unfortunate felt quality for people in struggling areas that you have to get out to make a success. And I think possibly one I think that is one argument for progressive politics and the left, that it should not try to engage with levelling up as a kind of coherent policy agenda, but should start trying to think in more creative ways about how it can. And I think this is where I am sympathetic to the devolution argument, but I perhaps wouldn't frame it actually. And John, actually, the argument is it that County Durham needs devolution? No, it needs community organisation, places and people feeling a greater sense of political representation and power in their local area. And I'm not necessarily sure that a kind of a mayor for county, I'm not even sure there's a mayor for County Durham, but whether a mayoral reform is the solution. It is about communities taking back control, to use the words of Dominic Cummings, where he was perhaps right. And so I think if we're to look to a more positive story, it is a qualitative story about places and people regaining power in lots of different ways, and perhaps not worrying so much about and not engaging with the rhetoric of levelling up, because I think it is essentially set up in a way that Labour can't win on the policy. So let's start thinking more creatively in different ways about how we might address some of these challenges in a pretty tough context in the next few years.
Well, thank you very much indeed. And given the time, I think I need to draw it to an end. And I'm sorry if our speakers had other points they wanted to come in on, and there are lots of unanswered questions. Thank you for those who put them in the chat. I suppose I'll abuse my position after everybody else has had the chance to speak, Will, by saying that as one of those ministers who once sat behind a desk trying to pull levers from Cornwall to Cumbria and knowing it doesn't work, actually the reason that devolution is important is we can't actually achieve any of these changes without a far higher degree of empowerment, including over the use of resources at local level. So I think the thing I take apart from this webinar is it's a question of how do we move this debate for one that can be seen as a peripheral set of issues in peripheral areas that are only temporarily important because they've become marginal constituencies, to seeing these actually central to the future of the nation we live in and the ability of governments of whatever colour to actually deliver for people. That, I think, is the challenge. And perhaps on the back of that, I can advertise our next webinar, which is on the 24th of February, where I'll be stepping out of the chair's role and be one of the speakers alongside Professor John Wilson at King's College, London. And we've been looking at these issues from a different point of view. The Labour assumption, widely held, that gaining power means winning a majority in Westminster and running things from there. And we will argue that actually that sort of statecraft has run its course and a very different approach is needed. So we'll be advertising that shortly. Hope so some of the people who've been on this webinar will join us for that on the 24th of January. But thanks particularly to John Tomaney for his introduction, but also to Judith Blake and Will Jennings. And thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you.